All right, welcome back to the afternoon session. We have a few more talks today before we can head out. And we are going to have something that I think we've been waiting for here. This is going to be a talk on just an update on dam removal. And so let me get back to the slideshow. And we have Ren here to talk from the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. So thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you guys for having me. Yes, my name is Ren. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, the entity tasked with the removal of the 4 lower Klamath dams. Let's get started. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the dams slated for removal. Copco number 1, Copco number 2, J.C. Boyle and Yreka. Copco number 2 was actually removed last summer. I'm not going to talk about Copco number 2 too much today because I could talk about Copco number 2 and its impacts for way too long. But know that it's out in Wards Canyon, the Kikacheki area is looking really good. This is the location of where the 4 dams are. The most important part is that Copco number 1 and number 2 are really closely sandwiched together. And that's important just for the context of why Copco number 2 came out last summer ahead of the other dams. First off, it was significantly smaller than the other dams, only standing 33 feet tall. Second of all, it didn't have a reservoir behind it. It was a diversion dam. And third, it was located right below Copco number 1. So it would have been in the way of the drawdown process. So that's why it was removed last summer. For today's presentation, I'm mostly going to focus on what we have done this year. So first, we'll start off with drawdown. We're definitely free and clear of the drawdown period, but understanding how the dams were constructed and how drawdown was implemented is like a really critically important portion of this project. So we'll start there. So for Iron Gate, we were able to utilize existing infrastructure, right, through the low-level outlet tunnel. This is original to the dam's construction back in 1962 is when this dam was completed. So this is it being constructed. You can see that they blasted a tunnel through the left or river right-hand side where they routed the river during construction, and there's gate infrastructure within this tunnel that allowed us to actually control the rate of drawdown here. And so for this dam on January 9th, we ramped down the amount of water coming out of the powerhouse and slowly opened up the gate to get us to about 1,000 CFS. And then on January 11th, we opened it up to about 2,200, and that was the beginning of drawdown on January 11th. And this is what Iron Gate is looking like now. Actually, it's looking a lot better than this now. This is shortly after drawdown was completed up at Iron Gate. And something interesting that you'll notice with a lot of the aerial images, and that didn't occur to me until I was out there watching these reservoirs drain, is that the landscapes beneath the reservoirs are actually quite different. Iron Gate kind of figured its way up through all of these different valleys and between little hillsides versus Copco that filled up a really big valley, which you'll see shortly here. Iron Gate has one of my favorite transformations from the drawdown period, and that would be up at Jenny Creek. So Jenny Creek is one of those high priority tributaries that will get a little bit more of an in-depth restoration treatment. But this is what Jenny Creek was looking like last summer. And then this is what Jenny Creek looked like after the drawdown period had concluded. And actually, Jenny Creek is already looking way different than this now. We had a lot more sediment accumulation at the mouth of all these tribs, right? Because sands and gravel, a natural part of any sort of river system. So these sediments would make their way downstream, hit the flat water, and stop there. So for those of you who are joining me out on a tour tomorrow, you'll see that for the river to find its historic path, it only had to cut through about 8 inches to a foot of dead algae. But around these tributaries, and around Jenny Creek in particular, there was over 25 feet of accumulated sands and gravels. And so it needed some help. So there was assisted sediment evacuation at this tributary. And then Resource and Environmental Solutions is our main contractor for the restoration, and they subcontracted with the Yreka tribe to help this tributary find its historic path. So that's Iron Gate drawdown. We implemented it at Iron Gate, and then we actually jumped up to J.C. Boyle for better sediment evacuation. We wanted J.C. Boyle sediments to get into the Copco reservoir before we initiated there. And I'm sure lots of you have seen this video, but just in case you haven't, this is what the drawdown at J.C. Boyle looks like. We were able to utilize culverts that were built into the base of the spillway that diverted the river's water during construction. And all we had to do was blast out the concrete plugs that were used to seal them. So this was on January 16th is when we initiated at J.C. Boyle. Oops. And then J.C. Boyle, significantly smaller reservoir than the other reservoirs. So it's only about 420 acres. The other reservoirs are about 1,000 acres. And so it drained in 17 hours. And I think our projections were 16. So pretty dang close. I think when a lot of folks saw these kind of images, they thought that Moonshine Falls had been revealed here, where the water's kind of going over that edge. That's actually the historic coffer dam. And the river, as you'll see later on, is back in its historic path, kind of farther to the river left there. That's a closer look at those going over the historic coffer dam. And now for Copco number 1, understanding why we did what we did to Copco number 1, you have to understand how this dam was built and when it was built. So Copco 1 was built, it was the first dam built between the years of 1911 and 1918. And the way they got the majority of the materials in there to build it was on rails. It is 125 feet tall, but when they were constructing this dam, they started digging, looking for bedrock to mount it to, and they didn't find it until they got 125 feet down. So it's 125 feet tall and 125 feet deep. And during its construction, it had the same diversion tunnel. You can kind of see it. Oh, I'll use my mouse. You can see it right here. It had its own diversion tunnel. That diversion tunnel was made in 1911 compared to Iron Gate's about 1957. And so it was a lot older. And so our engineers went and looked at that tunnel and they said, there's no way you can use that to do drawdown, right? It was under so much pressure from all the water behind it. They had serious concerns about cavitation. So in the situation for Copco 1, we made our own tunnel instead. So this work actually happened last summer. We blasted a tunnel 100 feet through the base of the dam, left a 10-foot plug at the end, inserted about a 60-foot long, 14-foot diameter steel pipe on the exterior, and then covered it with rock and riprap to protect it, or rock and concrete. And then the reason we inserted this steel pipe is that if we had just left the hole here, the pressure of all that water coming out would have created a scour hole here that could have undermined the structural integrity of the dam. So this pipe was put in place so that scour hole would be put safely away. And so actually, when we were making that tunnel, crews thought that they were going to use a giant mining drill to burrow their way through the base of the dam. And they made it about that far until they realized that mining drills can't make it through railroad rails, which it happens to be what they used to reinforce this dam. So then began a series of drilling, blasting, and excavating, which is, you will see, is a theme for the removal of Copco number 1. So crews would drill these small holes, pack them with powder, get out of there, and then blast. And so that was a repetitive cycle last summer. And so this was not delaying the schedule. We got everything done on time in the end, but they thought that making this tunnel would take like 3 weeks, and it took like 3 months instead. And this is just some people for scale. And this is what it looked like after it was done, right? So you can see that steel pipe in the exterior, everything that was built on top of it, and then that old diversion on the right-hand side of the slide. And later on, we were able to use this tunnel, right? After the reservoir was fully drained and no longer under pressure, we did actually switch over to utilizing the tunnel. But for the beginning of drawdown, this tunnel was very important. And it's trying to load a video. Again, I'm sure you guys have seen this video, but it's too fun if you haven't. And so that jet of water that you see spray up is actually the manhole that was built at the top of that tunnel. So for somebody, it was somebody's lucky job. The detonator for this explosion had a little raft, and he went down inside that manhole, paddled to the back of the dam, set the explosions, got out of there, and then they blasted. So that's the water spraying up through the manhole. And then while at Iron Gate, we had a gate so that we could actually control the rate of drawdown, right? We didn't have that at Copco, right? Saw that we made a tunnel to a very specific size. All the modeling around the drawdown period and dam schedule was done for a 50th percentile year, because we didn't know when we get into dam removal, right? And so that's what the tunnel was made for. It's like the math was supposed to be that it was the size as such that we would have 4,000 CFS and achieve the rate at the beginning of about 5 feet of drawdown per day. We got to January, we weren't in a 50th percentile year, at least at that point. So this reservoir drained faster than expected. It drained in about a week and 1.5. And this is a time lapse of that. So I think it goes over the course of about 2 weeks. And then this is, this is what it looked like once it was fully drained. And now you can see what I was talking about, where the Iron Gate Reservoir has lots of these thin, narrow channels. Copco Reservoir inundated this really big valley. And it's kind of fun to see because this stretch of the Klamath River didn't face the same fate that a lot of its tributaries did, where folks at some point came in and straightened out. This river still has lots of its bends in it. So as drawdown concluded, crews immediately got to work with the restoration. The revegetation portion. So this was done by the Yreka tribe, and all 2,200 acres of formerly submerged lands were mostly reseeded by hand, right? And so crews worked for about 5 years in advance. These same guys that went out and seeded the area by hand for the last 5 years have been out in the field around the reservoirs collecting native plant seeds from 98 different species. They collected 13 million seeds by hand. Those were taken to nurseries. They turned those into about 17 to 20 billion seeds. A rough estimate there, because I guess by weight, nobody's counting seeds. And those were mixed into 5 different seed mixes that were utilized in different areas of the reservoir. So those seed mixes were Rocky Wake, Grassland Chaparral, Upslope Riparian, and then there was a general aerial seed mix, because there was aerial seeding used in places where crews couldn't get to, whether the sediment was too wet and soggy for them to safely walk across it, or the slopes were too steep. Something you can see here too, these kind of larger, they look kind of like grass seeds. Those aren't actually the seeds. Those are rice husks, because all the native plant seeds are actually quite teeny tiny. And so rice husks were added to the mix so that seed crews could have a visual indication of the areas they had already passed over. So by March, crews had planted 72,000 bare rootstock plants, mostly perennials, into the ground, 27,000 acorns, and 65,000 pounds of seed. And now we're seeing good growth out in the reservoirs. You know, you'll see, guys, we'll see, for those who are joining us for a tour tomorrow, as you move up through the reservoir, it gets greener and greener. The areas down by the dams themselves were seeded last, because as we went through spring, we would experience some refill and drainage and refill and drainage, right? So the upper areas definitely are turning green first, and definitely differences in rate of growth depending on which seed mix was applied, right? What kind of plants are down there, the terrain it was laid on, how much moisture content, and then when they got to it, right? So like the areas the crew seeded first look super, super good. The stuff they kind of got to at the end, the plants are significantly smaller. So now we'll move into the more fun part, the deconstruction part, right? So I wanted to draw your attention to that we had the initial drawdown period, which is just the draining of all the water in the reservoirs, but then there was also a period for refill and release, right? As we got big storms or spring runoff, we would see refill and release. And Copco No. 1 is a concrete dam compared to Iron Gate and JC Boyle, which are earthen dams. Earthen dams means that they're just a big pile of rocks. And the worst thing you can do to an earthen dam is have it overtopped with water. It just falls apart. It's called catastrophic dam failure. But because Copco No. 1 was a big concrete arch dam, we could start deconstructing it as soon as the initial phase was concluded, because we could have the dam halfway deconstructed, have a huge flow event, and the water would just safely pass over the top of the dam. So we were able to start deconstructing Copco in about March 15th, I think, is when we started. And this is the first blast that we did on the dam. This was called the test blast. Yeah. So that was just blast number 1. And following that, following the blast, it is a cycle. You blast, chip, excavate, drill, repeat, right? Because, mostly the blasting, despite that one that shows a really big grand explosion. I got another big grand explosion for you too. Mostly the intention is to introduce fractures so that these big machines can go on, they chip away, turn it into manageable parts that's put into haul trucks and hauled away, right? And then once they've cleaned up all the debris from the last blast, then they go in, they drill a series of small holes, pack those with powder, blast again, clean up the area. And so that has been the cycle of doing smaller blasts. But then this blast was last week where they actually blew off the top 30 feet of the dam. Well, not the top 30 feet, the top of the we had eventually gotten to. We had already dropped the dam down about 30 feet from there. So this was 30 feet all in one go. And to see this blast, I think you'll have to watch Shane's movie. I just wanted to draw the attention to the construction of this dam again. Like I said, reinforced with road rails. I found this chunk after the most recent blast. You can see they just kind of tied them together with wire to set them in the concrete. Something I've heard from the engineers working on this project too is that the concrete doesn't blast the way it wanted to because the concrete's not as hard as it should have been because the aggregate that they used is all pumice rock and cinder for the construction of the dam. So the different spots of the dams, they all have different hardness and it's never what they expect. So I've been told. These dams, fun fact, lead engineer on them was J.C. Boyle. And when he actually started working on this dam, they hired him fresh out of college. He had just graduated from UC Berkeley in 1910. And in 1911, they brought him on to build a dam. So that might have something to do with some of the funny construction is that it was engineered by a 23-year-old. And then just want to show you that for Copco #1, all of its material, it went through a bunch of testing. It's very inert. It's being buried up on site up here in this area, which is about like 300 feet above the river level, as you can see. I'll use this as an opportunity to point out is that this is where Copco #2 used to be. So you can really see that Copco #2 was built right below Copco #1. So deconstruction of Iron Gate. Like I said, Iron Gate is an earthen dam. It wasn't built with the same intention of Copco 1, 2, and J.C. Boyle though. I believe that PacifiCorp did own this project at this point. Copco stands for California Oregon Power Company, and so those were the original owners of the dams. And then in the late 50s, they were sold to PacifiCorp. And the feds came through, and they actually required PacifiCorp to then build this dam as a public safety mitigation. And that's because the dams upstream are peaking dams, when in essence means that when they're not generating power, there was no water going downstream. I think that's where a lot of the misinformation about that the river used to run dry comes from, is because the other infrastructure actually would make the river dry for periods of time. But then the operators would go to work and they'd flip the switch, start generating power, and 1,000 CFS of water would go downstream. So the river would be dry in this area, but down in like Syed Happy Camp, there'd be enough tribs in the area, enough water that you actually would have a little bit of a river. So there's instances where people were down swimming or fishing. All of a sudden this wall of water would come through and people were drowning. And so Iron Gate was actually built as a public safety mitigation. And so despite it being the newest dam, this one was really bad at generating electricity. It generated way less electricity than the other dams. And it was because its spot wasn't chosen for power generation, but for public safety. I also want to just draw your attention real quick to some of the infrastructure. So this is the spillway. All of these dams, none of them provided any sort of flood control, right? They're kept at their full capacity because the water was pulled from just under the surface over here. So the water would come down this penstock, go through the powerhouse here, and then come out, and that's where the river, that's historically how water would travel downstream. When it would rain and the reservoir would overtop, it would go down the spillway here. We have been utilizing this low-level outlet tunnel, though. And then this is old fish hatchery infrastructure over there. I also want to note, to emphasize that this dam was not built with the intention of flood control. This dam was completed in 1962, and then it was almost overtopped in the 64 flood. It was damaged. And so they said, oh no, didn't build the dam high enough, so they raised it 5 feet. And then the 97 flood came around and FERC said, hey, you actually didn't build it high enough still. So they raised the dam again. And so that plays into deconstruction in the next slide. So earthen dam had to wait for the spring flow period to pass. In the meantime, we were deconstructing all of the relevant, or all the infrastructure that wasn't important to the dam's structural stability, but was pertinent to the deconstruction process. So this is them ripping out the fish ponds. They've also done away with the powerhouse there. This headstock will actually remain in place until we are completely through any sort of risk of flows, because it can be used to funnel water downstream if we did get refill. But on May 1st, we got approvals to start the removal. Well, at least the removal of the first 13 feet. It was all of that material, like I noted previously, the 2 times they had raised the height of the dam is what we had approval to remove. So these metal gates that go across the top are actually how they raised the dam in the after the 97 requirement. They were about 6 feet tall, and then they went 13 feet down into the base of the dam. So to begin deconstruction, crews, first, what this guy's doing is just widening the top of the dam so that we could actually fit machines up there. And then a big machine came on, grabbed the top of these sheets, and would vibrate them and pull them out in place. After they got a few of them out, they would just yoink them right out. And yoink is the technical term. And then they had the approvals from FERC to do that between May 1st, May 13th. On May 13th, we had the approval to proceed with the removal, therefore. So they do a tiered approach, you can kind of see here, where this guy is actually about 15 feet above the plateau that this guy is on. So they start removing a layer, and then the other guy catches up, and then they move back the other way. And this material is hauled off in these trucks. This picture, they look like little toys. They are not. They hold about 55 yards of material, or 70 tons. They're averaging about 400 truckloads a day right now. And the material presently is being deposited in the spillway. So you can see that when they constructed this spillway, they blasted it into the cliff side. And so they're moving the material back in here to refill the spillway. Most of the concrete will stay in place to provide some structural support to those narrow cliff edges, but then kind of the bits that poke out around those will be chipped away. And then once they fill in the spillway, they'll move over here. Obviously an outdated image. I didn't have a more current satellite image, but you can kind of see this impression over here. So this used to be a larger hillside that they harvested to construct the dam itself. So one of my favorite things about the deconstruction of Iron Gate is that we'll pretty much just scoop it up and put it back where it came from, refilling this slope over here. It's about a 37-acre area. So on May 13th, we also received the approvals to move forward with the deconstruction of J.C. Boyle. The J.C. Boyle Dam up in Oregon generated the vast majority of the power for the whole project. The other infrastructure was so old, it wasn't very good at generating power anymore. And like I said, Iron Gate wasn't very good at that as well. This one was also a diversion dam that funneled the water about 2 miles downstream, but it didn't funnel all of the river out. It had a little bit, it had some water going through there, more than Copco No. 2. And on May 13th, we were able to break ground here. You can see that it's half clay core earthen dam and half concrete spillway, significantly smaller than the other dams. Iron Gate's around 100, or it was about 180 feet tall. Copco's 125. This guy's only 66. And so what they're doing now is they'll remove all of this earthen portion. They will take it down to, this is the coffer dam that routes the river over here. They will take it down to the coffer dam probably this week, pause, and then on June 1st, remove the rest of it. Something exciting about J.C. Boyle is that, so the river's going down on this side, right, which has been its path during this dam's existence, but the historic river path actually goes over here. And so crews will remove all of this earthen portion. We'll get to a point where we'll then break apart the coffer dam. The river will be routed actually back into its historic path, and then they'll work on deconstructing all the concrete infrastructure. So you'll have the first dam, or to be not completely removed, but to have achieved volitional fish passage will be J.C. Boyle, and it will happen before we even know it. And so, like I said, J.C. Boyle, significantly smaller. I should actually note this timeline, every week my timeline's out of date. We're pretty far ahead of schedule, right? Because you can see that we were supposed to have a phased demolition beginning in this time, but the conditions were such that our phased demolition actually began at the beginning of May for both of these dams, and crews are working fast. And so I suspect, the goal is to have full volitional fish passage by October. I suspect it will be much sooner than that. Copco No. 1 will be removed, the next dam to be fully removed, because we got such an early start on it. Then it'll be J.C. Boyle because it's so much smaller. And then we'll reach a point sometime this late summer, early fall, where Iron Gate has been completely removed. All the other dams are removed, their coffer dams opened up, and we'll have graded the riverbed from where Iron Gate used to be, and we'll break the coffer dam, and that will be the moment that we actually have fish passage in a free-flowing condition. So that is a very exciting day. Something you should also be prepared for, though, is that behind these dams, right, these two also had coffer dams, but they don't have the same issue of sediment accumulation. There is some sediment accumulation behind Iron Gate. Copco #1, the river has been going below the dam where we had made that tunnel, right? So that area is all cleared out there already. Similarly at JC Boyle, they'll have removed all of that material, but so we can expect to see another pulse of sediment whenever we do breach this coffer dam. Nothing compared to January, but we can expect that. And that's all I have for now. So I was told I have a half hour.
Questions? We've got some hands. Let's just start here.
Just a comment. I just want to acknowledge the amount of grief and drama, ridiculousness that you have been exposed to in your presentations, and acknowledge the professionalism with which you have conducted yourself during these presentations. I've seen a few that were rough, and you guys are awesome.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
I was just wondering, how do we get like a bowling ball or softball sized piece of Copco concrete?
Oh, I can arrange that. Oh, are you coming out tomorrow?
Yeah, in the
Yeah,
afternoon.
I will make sure there are
Okay.
chunks of concrete
Awesome.
available.
Thank- I'd like two, actually.
And I have Iron Gate too. I saved the first scoop of Iron Gate, and my pile is shrinking rapidly. But if you come out tomorrow, you can have a piece of Iron Gate too.
Eli's always ask tough questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Questions though?
It's a late summer slug of sediment when Iron Gate cofferdam gets breached, expected to be a problem for adult fish in the river.
It's not. When I asked, they told me it was not. And I asked them to do some modeling around it just in case. So that's being done now. So I can get back to you on that.
Other questions?
We get a rundown of tomorrow's tour. What's possible?
Yeah, rundown for tomorrow's tours. So folks who signed up for the tours, we are pretty much full. I don't know how much flexibility there is. But we have tours starting at 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. So we can meet initially earlier than those times at the Miners Inn in Yreka to kind of set up carpool convoy. But then we'll want to be ready to start the tour at Yreka Hatchery at 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. for the two tours in about 3.5 hours or so.
About 3 hours. We unfortunately won't be able to go inside the Copco complex tomorrow, but that does give us the ability to have some more folks along for the tours. You can take up to 20 now.
Okay, so we do have some extra space. If anyone who wants to go on one of the tours who didn't sign up yet, want to raise their hand? You have an interest? Okay, well, we'll keep it to a nice 15 or so, but that sounds great. Otherwise, yeah, do we need helmets or any PPE or
You got
anything?
everything you'll need. But you guys have to, and I know it's tough because it's getting warm out, but you do have to wear pants and closed-toed shoes.
Okay.
Mm.
It's good to know. Yep. All right. Any other questions?
Oh, I know, especially as it gets hot.
All right. Ren, that was great to see. I know we normally post PDFs of slides, but boy, if there's anything here with the videos you showed, it's just very powerful. We can talk offline to see if there's
Yeah, I can
any
certainly
options.
share.
So might be a question here online.
Oh, yeah.
How far downriver is the sediment now?
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
kind of a tough thing to answer, right? Because the sediment conditions on the river kind of change every week, especially whenever we had refill and then there'd be drainage again, right? It'd send another little pulse of sediment downstream. You can think of it as like when you get to the bottom of your when you're drinking tea and you get to the bottom of the cup, all the crud accumulates there. That's why NIMS purposely implementing those geomorphic flows back in the spring. And so the river conditions were looking really good 2 weeks ago or so. And then we had refill and another little pulse of sediment went downstream. So precisely where is the sediment downstream? Kind of tough to answer. But the farther you get downstream, and when I was looking at some graphs shared with me by the Copco tribe, who does all of our water quality monitoring, the turbidity in April was actually less than the turbidity in the river this time last year. Again, had another sediment pulse last week, so that might have changed things, but.
All right. Any other questions? Nothing else online? All right. Ren, thank you so much.
All right,
That was
thank you,
really
guys.
great to see.